So welcome, everybody. I really sincerely appreciate your time this evening. Thank you for joining us. This is a session called Celebrating and Supporting English Learners and Language-Rich Families in Early Childhood Education. My name is Kendra Dickinson, and I am the District English Learner Coordinator for the Colchester Public Schools. I think that most of us know each other, but if you'd like to jump in and introduce yourself and maybe say what your role is in Colchester or beyond, that would be great. Maybe we'll start with Cindy.
Okay, Cindy Praisner, the Early Childhood Coordinator for C3. I think I know everyone. Who joined us. I did tell her that.
Thank you for joining us. And let's take it to Christina.
Hi, I'm Christina Swain. Most of you know me too. I think I'm a preschool teacher in the school readiness classroom at Castle with 3- and 4-year-olds.
Great to have you, Christina. And we have Judy with us. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Judy O'Mara, principal of Colchester Elementary. Thanks for doing this.
Thank you. Thank you for joining us. And we have Megan with us tonight.
Megan Amato, assistant principal at CES.
Thank you, Megan. And Rebecca.
Becky Berta, home daycare provider in Colchester.
Thank you for joining us, Becky. And Katie.
Katie Theo Green. I am a kindergarten teacher at CES.
Thank you for joining us, Katie. Thank you all. So again, my name is Kendra Dickinson. I began my career, just a little bit about me. I began my career as a dual language kindergarten teacher. And in those days, 2003, what we did was we taught only in English in the morning and then only in Spanish in the afternoon. That was the model that we followed. When my own children were young, I started to get more and more interested in teaching high school, believe it or not. So even though I had taught kindergarten and I had a master's in early childhood education, my husband was teaching high school at the time, and I actually transitioned to teaching 8th and 9th grade English, ELA, which is a big change. I did that for 5 years, and then I made another transition to being a TESOL teacher. TESOL's teacher for English, teachers for speakers of teaching English to speakers of other languages. Oh my gosh. And I have really found a passion in teaching dually identified students. So dually identified students are students that have an IEP or that have a 504 and are also English learners. And as a side note, I'm also a certified doula. So that, if that's something that maybe you've heard a little bit about, that's a professional labor and delivery assistant. So a non-medical labor and delivery assistant. So I'm really passionate about human development and families and early childhood. I'm also a mother. Here's my family photo, the selfie photo from this Christmas. I have 2 daughters, one that's a freshman in high school and one that's in 7th grade. So 2 teenagers, which is exciting. So who are language-rich families? Language-rich family is a term that I have sort of developed and used to talk about our families that speak 2 or more languages or a language that's different from English in their home. Believe it or not, in the Colchester Public Schools, we have over 9 different languages spoken, which is really exciting. Some families are bilingual, some families speak 3 or more languages at home. It's really a diverse, interesting place to work and live, especially when you consider it's a small town. And then who are our English learners? So there's an identification process that's laid out by the state of Connecticut, and it starts with the home language survey. When you register for pre-K or for kindergarten in Connecticut, you fill out this home language survey, and it asks 3 important questions. Number 1, what is the primary language used in the home, regardless of the language spoken by the student? Number 2, what is the language most often spoken by the student? And number 3, what is the language that the student first acquired? When a parent or guardian fills out this form, if the answer to any of those questions, one or more of those questions, is a language other than English, we have what's called a potential English learner. This child goes then to have an assessment, and we use the pre-LOS or the LOS links. That's the form of assessment that we use. And we try to determine, okay, is this child eligible for English learner services or not? If the child is eligible, the parent always has the right to consent to English language services or not, or to waive the services. And interestingly, in Connecticut, pre-K4 students are eligible for English learner services. It's not mandatory in Connecticut, but it's highly encouraged that if the parent consents, that a pre-K4 child receives those EL services. When a child receives English learner services, that can be right in the classroom. So we're in a second grade classroom, in a kindergarten classroom. It can be a one-on-one setting, or it can be a small group setting. And then each year, an English learner takes an assessment called the LOS Links assessment test, which we're in this LOS Links window right now, this testing window. I call it LOS Links Land. And it's this once-a-year assessment that measures the child's speaking growth, listening growth, reading growth, and writing growth. And we can track year after year, year over year, how much these children are learning and how much they're growing and developing. And that is a really, really fun part about being an EL teacher. So I thought I'd talk just briefly about the stages of second language acquisition. I'll give you a moment to read the slide. One really interesting aspect of second language acquisition is that we often see what we call a silent period. So when a child enters a child care setting, or when a child enters kindergarten for the first time, or pre-K for the first time, or really any grade, the child can experience what's called this silent period. This is very, very, very normal. The child is taking in this new language, English. The child is learning sounds and words and vocabulary, and they might have so much going on with their receptive language that they don't say much. This can be a few days, this can be a few weeks, this can be a few months. This is very, very normal in the development because the child's taking it all in. So then we move to early production, so short words and phrases, and then emergent speech. And then here's the next set of stages. You'll notice that the child is moving more and more and more throughout the stages toward proficiency. And I'll give you a moment to read the slides. You'll see that even in the advanced fluency stage, things like idiomatic expressions, like she's at the top of her class, can be really tricky for an English learner. And an English learner, even when they have advanced fluency, can still have an accent and they can still have pronunciation differences. This is very, very normal in terms of a child's development. So the million-dollar question, what happens when we have infants and toddlers and young children that are exposed to 2 or more languages as they are developing? And the answer is really fascinating. So when we track the development of infants and toddlers, we track these major milestones. And one of the major milestones, of course, of an infant is babbling. So how much do they babble and when does it begin? And really interestingly, monolingual babies, so babies that just speak one language, on average begin to babble at 27.3 weeks. Bilingual babies, so babies exposed to 2 or more languages, begin to babble at 26.7 weeks. And in terms of the amount or the frequency of babbling, there's no discernible difference. Something that's really interesting is that young babies can begin to really differentiate the facial movements. So when you speak two different languages, your face, the actual shape of your face changes, the various facial movements, and babies can really track that and notice that. Babies can also really tune into the different rhythms of a language. So someone that speaks Swedish is going to have a different rhythm to their language than someone that speaks Spanish. And babies can really tune into that. And I think that that's really fascinating. In terms of toddlers, at 14 months, believe it or not, toddlers can develop associative word learning at the same rate. That's just a fancy way of saying that a monolingual child can learn cup, bowl, dog. So an object that's linked with a word is associative word learning. And a monolingual child and a bilingual child can learn, welcome, monolingual child and a bilingual child can learn those words at the same rate. At 20 months, something really exciting happens. And that is that at 20 months, toddlers can begin to understand phrases and sentences that are code mixed or code switched. Code switching is when within a sentence you use two or more languages, or within a paragraph or a story you use two or more languages. So I'll tell you the example that always stands out in my mind. So when I was teaching dual language kindergarten, this is back in the early 2000s, I was working in the Hartford Public Schools. I had a kindergartner walk in and she said, "Mrs. Dickinson, you'll never believe it. My friend has piojos." And I looked at this little girl and I said, "Good for her. That is so exciting. I can't believe it. Yay." Like, wow, you're excited. I'm excited. I didn't know what that word meant. So a few minutes later, I went to my neighbor teacher, who's a native Spanish speaker, and I said, I've heard this word piojos. What is this? And she said, "Oh my gosh, it's lice." And I said, "Oh no!" I just cheered for this little girl who was telling me that her friend had lice. But this using two different languages in the same sentence is very, very normal. It's not a sign that the child is confused. It's not a sign that there's some sort of language delay happening. It's just very, very typical of bilingual and multilingual children. And they can begin to produce those sentences and understand those sentences in toddlerhood, which I think is so neat. In terms of our bilingual preschoolers, bilingual and monolingual preschoolers continue to learn new words at the same rate. It gets a little tricky sometimes because you might be interacting or communicating with a bilingual child and you might think to yourself, this child maybe doesn't have as many vocabulary words as his or her monolingual peer. What's really important is that we take the vocabulary words that the child knows in both languages and add them together. So for example, if you have a monolingual English-speaking child, maybe she knows 100 words, 100 vocabulary words. And you have a bilingual young man who is an English speaker and a Spanish speaker. He probably knows 50 distinct words in Spanish or 50 or more distinct words in English. And it's really important that we add those together to determine how many words, how many vocabulary words a child has. Okay, so another $1 million question that I'm often asked is there a bilingual advantage? In other words, if, I speak a second language to my child or I expose my child to a second language, is there a cognitive advantage to this? So, of course, there's a wonderful advantage of being able to travel and understand another language. Being bilingual can also help with employment. And of course, being able to communicate and being a part of two different cultures is an amazing opportunity. What the science tells us, though, is that in terms of a cognitive advantage, what they have seen in adults and children that are bilingual is they are better able to switch back and forth between tasks, which is really interesting when you think about it. And science thinks that because of all this code switching, that adults and children can seamlessly switch tasks when they're bilingual just a bit more easier. The science also tells us that this exposure and this stimulation to another language, a second language, is really enriching for your brain. And I think that for all of us as educators, whether we're English speakers, whether we're bilingual or multilingual, it's important to recognize that just hearing the words in another language, just the exposure, really enriches your brain. And the science has told us that the impact it can have on a developing brain is similar to what happens when infants and toddlers and young children are exposed to music. So that beautiful enrichment and stimulation really mirrors what happens in our brain when we hear a language other than our home language. Okay, so a little bit earlier when we were talking about the stages of second language acquisition, we talked just briefly about how even when a child is fluent in a second language or a third language, even when they've reached proficiency, it's very, very normal for the child to still have an accent or to have some pronunciation differences. So in American culture, we tend to really elevate and really celebrate and get excited about certain accents. We love actors and actresses that can, pull off these roles that have accents, and we think it's so cool. Oh my gosh, Meryl Streep, how does she do that accent? That's really amazing. And I have certainly experienced that in my life too. So I was lucky enough to meet, as a much younger woman, the very famous Jacques Pepin, the famous chef. And I'll never forget how he said my name, Kendra Dickinson. I won't do it justice, but it had like its own beautiful rhythm and its own beautiful accent. What's interesting about Jacques Pepin and meeting him and being in this audience of people that were meeting him is that nobody sat there and said, oh, I hope he can pronounce his vowels. I hope he can read. I hope that there's not a communication issue here. We loved him for who he is. These people that were here to see his talk, we loved his accent and we really relished it, right? We thought it was so like romantic. I mean, you can see on my face, I'm like just beaming to be able to meet him. Unfortunately, and often for people of color, people that have accents are not always elevated to that level as Jacques Pepin. People with accents, unfortunately, face bias. They face discrimination. Even young children, unfortunately, feel sometimes stereotypes and bias because they have pronunciation differences or because they have an accent. So it's really, really important that all of us work toward eliminating some of the common misconceptions and stereotypes about children that have an accent. And I think it's just important for us to know that they exist and that a heavy accent doesn't necessarily mean that there's a communication issue or a communication disorder. So sometimes when we're looking at young children, and more so this happens toward middle school and high school, but sometimes we might say to ourselves, oh my gosh, how do I fix this accent? You know, he or she continues to speak with an accent. It could be that it's a part of their identity, just like Jacques Pepin, and they might always speak English with an accent or with pronunciation differences, and that's okay. And I think if we can wrap our mind around the fact that maybe their vowels won't sound exactly the same as someone who only spoke English, or maybe there'll be some sound differences, it doesn't mean that necessarily there's a disorder or a delay. So that's why it's really key for us as educators and people that interact with young people throughout our day and practitioners to always ask ourselves the question, okay, when we hear this child talk, what am I hearing? Am I hearing a difference Is this an accent or pronunciation? Or am I truly hearing a delay or a disorder? This is very, very complicated. This is tricky. And that's why I always recommend that people really take a team approach and have a collaborative conversation about what they hear when they communicate with a child. There's a really interesting paradox with English learners and with bilingual children. There is both an over-identification for special education and speech and language and an under-identification for special education and speech and language. So we as practitioners and educators just have to really make sure that we're keep asking ourselves the question, is it really a delay or disorder, or is it just a difference? And it's very challenging, which is why the teamwork approach definitely works. Part of what I'd like to talk about today is how do we take a strengths-based approach? What can we do in terms of our mindset? Like how do we develop an understanding and a celebratory mode for our diverse learners? And then also, what do we do in our classrooms, in our daycare centers, in our home-based centers to really strengthen the connection that we have with our multilingual families and really celebrate them? So here are some things that we can do. We know that asset-based language or strength-based language is really, really powerful. We also want to do things like say it, state and celebrate the home language or the culture of our students. These are things that are beautiful gifts, and we're going to see a quick video about this in a minute. But these languages that our children are coming to school with and the cultures that our children are coming to school with are beautiful gifts that we can talk about and celebrate openly. We're also going to hear from a professor at Eastern Connecticut State University, and she's going to talk to us a little bit about educators as historians and sociologists. And I think the point she makes about learning your own culture as the teacher and being able to share that and then inviting your students to share their culture is really powerful and impactful. And she's also going to take a moment to talk about biases that we all have and how we can consciously start to let go of those biases and take a strengths-based approach. Okay, so this is called Affirming Children's Linguistic Identity.
A language is not just words, it is part of a child's identity. Language is associated with their home, their emotional life and security, and it is and will be an integral part of their culture. The first time children hear I love you, they hear it in a specific language, and that stays with them. Language affirmation is identity affirmation. And as children enter the social medium for the first time through school, they should be welcomed by a world that does not place them, their identity, language, race, and culture as inferior. My boy was 6 and had just started school in a suburban, predominantly white town when he told me in a store, "Mommy, speak to me in English because they're going to think we're poor." I was shocked and I said, "No, sweetie, they're going to think we're smart." I could not believe it. Why would a Mexican-American 6-year-old already have a prejudice against the language or be aware of a prejudice against the language? We all have biases. And if we don't accept that we have biases, we will not be attentive on how they might reflect in our classroom. We could spend more time reflecting on our own identity and the identities of our students in connection to the history and the context of different groups. So in a way, all educators, we need to be historians and sociologists. Once we depict our own identity and we feel comfortable with it and we learn to appreciate it, then we can do the same with others' identities, including those of minority groups. Teachers can help develop genuine empathy, which is a foundation for justice.
Barely, look at what you did to Denise's face. She was disappointed, and you made her happy.
And also teachers can prepare children for a world that will require self-advocacy, the ability to articulate one's needs and make informed decisions about the support necessary to meet those needs.
What you want to talk, Cammy?
I don't like that.
So self-advocacy also implies, therefore, being able to speak and act on one's behalf to correct inequities.
You are out. Back over here. You can come in here and you don't destroy everything. Okay.
I believe that the key is the language that we as educators use. So with attention and practice, we can stay away from saying that such and such way is right or wrong, and we can address the so-called right way of saying things by calling it instead the school way. Children tend to match expectations and assumptions, so we should let them see that we think of their racial and linguistic identity as wonderful.
Now, mommy's tour in Russian.
Russian song?
Yes.
Антошка, Антошка, пойдем копать картошку. Антошка, Антошка, пойдем копать картошку. Тили-тили, трали-вали. Это мы не проходили, это нам не задавали. Парам-пам-пам, парам-пам-пам.
A language is not just words, it is part of a child's identity. Language.
So I think I really fell in love with that video because it reminds us about the power of our language and of our words as teachers and educators and childcare providers. So what I have up here on the screen are some strength-based or asset-based language where we can affirm a children's identity, their linguistic identity. Like all fields in education, we just have some words and phrases that are outdated, and I've suggested in the right-hand side column some updated language for us. So for example, we used to say English as a second language, and what we realized as this field has grown, and it's still such a young field, but what we realized is we had students for whom English was their third language, their fourth language. We have children right in Colchester, right in pre-K, right in kindergarten, throughout the Colchester schools, for whom English is their third and fourth language. And that is just so remarkable and exciting. So now we say English language learner or simply English learner. We're really trying to get away from phrases like I see a language barrier or there's broken English. We're really trying to reset our minds to think gift-based, strength-based, and to phrase the needs of the family more positively. So, wow, you know, your mom is from Haiti and speaks Haitian Creole. Let's get your mom an oral interpreter. Or you're still learning English. Little by little, you're getting there, right? So this really strength-based, asset-based language. This is a quick video that just talks very briefly about this idea that English learners and our multilingual families are a gift to be celebrated and encouraged and supported.
We see our students as having gifts. It's not a detriment to speak another language. It's a gift. Some of these babies are traveling to different countries, having to assimilate in different communities with different family members, with different friends in classrooms. That takes a high level of emotional intelligence, which to me is a gift to be able to do successfully. And I don't think we give our second language learners and our immigrant students enough credit for what they have to do as children. Lord knows I couldn't do it as an adult. So our staff sees these gifts in our students, not just the academic gifts, but the emotional talents. And we try to really reach out and find those gifts and talents. And I'm very proud. One of the things that we do at Miniville is we have a very high number of students found eligible and brought up for eligibility for gifted. And I think that's a place that we want to be. And it just takes a change in perspective of how you see these students. It's not they're not academic challenged, but these are students of promise. We just have to make sure that we're actively seeing that. We see our students as having gifts.
Okay. All right, so you might be wondering, okay, what can I do tomorrow? What can I start to do next week? What's something that I can weave in and incorporate into my day? What does this look like throughout the day to really support and celebrate our multilingual children and our English learners? Okay, so a good place to start is morning meeting. And I promised that there would be a singing portion of this presentation. So here it is. It's the moment you've been waiting for. So when we do our greeting songs, and certainly this can go up through 2nd grade, this can be infant toddler room, very adaptable. So there's a hello song in Spanish that I'll sing for you now. So it goes, hola, 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 ¿y cómo estás? Yo estoy bien, y espero que tú también. Hello, 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 and how are you? I'm fine, and I hope that you are too. With some practice, you can even add in some American Sign Language if you feel like you're going to really get advanced. So you can go, hello, 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 and how are you? But that's like level 10. That's like 10 stars on Yelp, right? Okay. Then we also have a Days of the Week song that you can sing in English and Spanish. And I should have pointed out, these are songs that are in Spanish. I learned Spanish in high school and college, and then I worked as a medical interpreter, believe it or not. So oral interpretation for Spanish-speaking clients and English-speaking doctors and nurses. So that's how I learned my Spanish. So these are Spanish-speaking songs. And then here's the days of the week. You can sing Domingo, lunes, martes, miércoles, jueves, viernes, sábado. Domingo, lunes, martes, miércoles, jueves, viernes, sábado. Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday. Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday. And then there's a colors song. Red is rojo, red is rojo, blue, azul, blue, azul, yellow, amarillo, yellow, amarillo, brown cafe, brown cafe. And if you're thinking to yourself, well, Kendra, it's been a long time since I took Spanish, or I'm not really a Spanish speaker, it really is just about your effort, right? And you're exposing all of your learners, all of your children, and you're sending a message that you value diversity, just in this little song about the different colors in English and Spanish, that you value diversity, that you value language skills, that it is a gift, and you're sending that message and exposing all of your children in your class or in your center. So those are some songs that you can use to start off your day. When we move to, and I can see that the T is out of place, my apologies. When we move to our literacy block, there are so many books now available in so many languages. So just the difference between, so I first started teaching dual language kindergarten in 2003. The difference between 2003 and 2021 is enormous. So here are some examples of Eric Carle books that are in Spanish. It's great to prominently display them and point out, oh my gosh, look at this story that we all love. Do you remember that very hungry caterpillar? Oh my gosh, we laughed so hard. Look, it's in Spanish. Isn't this amazing? If you want to read it in Spanish, but maybe you're not a Spanish speaker. There's lots of YouTube videos where a native Spanish speaker will read it in Spanish. And again, it's about celebrating and putting diversity out in front and saying, look at this. This is beautiful. We love these stories. And there's so, like I said, there's so many books, and they're actually at all of our public libraries. The public librarians are so helpful. So if you go to the Colchester Public Library and you say, I would like to please take out 5 books that are in Mandarin Chinese, or books that are in Mandarin Chinese and English, they are so incredibly helpful. And even if they don't have the books right at the Colchester Library, they will get them for you in 2 days. They'll use interlibrary loan. I live in East Hampton, and these Eric Carle books are all from the East Hampton Public Library. So they are a huge resource and a huge asset to us. Absolutely. Okay, so certainly music and movement is a great opportunity to celebrate our multilingual families and our English learners. This can be done through audio recordings. YouTube is a great resource. So if you're looking for that movement break in the middle of your day, especially, I guess it's going to get really cold tomorrow, these cold, wintry days, you might be looking for that movement break. In terms of mathematics, I have really taken to this woman called Jess, and she's on YouTube, and she runs this YouTube channel called Canta con Jess, Counting with Jess. She is so passionate about bilingual children and multilingual children. She has made dozens and dozens and dozens of videos. These could be a warm-up. These could be part of a math lesson. These could be another great movement break, because she puts movement with all of the learning. And she's just, I don't know, I just fell in love with her. She's genuine. She's excited. So I'll let you see a little bit of Conta con Jess.
Contemos de 10 en 10 hasta 100. Let's count to 100 by tens. 10, 10, 20, 20, 30, 30, 40, 40, 50, 50, 60, 60, 70, 70, 80, 80, 90, 90, 100, 100. Vamos en grupos pequeños. Let's go in small groups. 10, 20.
So all of her videos are just charming, so simple. It's always just her. And like I said, she's so passionate about exposure to another language, and she always involves movement breaks, and she's a great, great resource.
Contemos de 10 en 10 hasta 100.
Pause that. Okay, another thing that we can do throughout our day is to make sure that we're using visual communication boards. You'll see on the left-hand side a communication board that talks about snack time. So it's a pictorial representation. I mean, this is really helpful for so many of our friends in a childcare setting or at school. It's a pictorial representation with quick snippets of what we're doing to get ready for snack time. On the right-hand side, you'll see multilingual labels. So table, mesa, carpet. This just really does 2 things. First of all, if you happen to have a Spanish speaker, they can connect the 2 languages, right? And make that leap between their home language and maybe their newer language of English. Secondly, if you have monolingual children in your class, it just sends the message that there's a whole other world out there. There's a whole beautiful world called multilingualism, and there's Spanish, and we have Urdu speakers and Mandarin Chinese and Cantonese speakers and Korean speakers. These are not things that you have to make from scratch. So many are available on Teachers Pay Teachers for free. So if you go to Teachers Pay Teachers and click the free box, so many of these labels are available for free. You do not have to spend your precious time reinventing the wheel. And then the one on the left, you can tell I sort of, it's a snapshot from Etsy, and it's like $2. But truly, so many of these are free. And if this is something that you're interested in for your center or your classroom, I'm very happy to help resource these, source these and make them as well. This is a really interesting point that I wanted to make, and it might seem a little counterintuitive because, of course, in early childhood education, we're all about language-rich environments, print-rich environments, two-way communications with children. One thing to consider is if you look at a child's day in your child care center, in your pre-K classroom, in your elementary school classroom, do they have any time where they can take a break from how exhausting it is to be learning English? So do they have some language-free time? I know that sounds kind of counterintuitive, but does their brain get a few minutes, and I know it's hard to squeeze in, to do an activity like blocks or puzzles or clay where they can participate, but it's not so language heavy. So many times when I go to work with our English learners, especially if they have a time slot that's toward the end of the day, teachers will say to me, she's so tired. And I say, I know, I can't even imagine. I mean, you're learning content, you're learning about the Eric Carle book, and you're learning English at the same time. So that's just like so normal to be exhausted at the end of the day. And it's just something to consider, like, does this child have a break during the day where the language load is a little bit less? Okay, so that is the end of my presentation, and I want to see if anybody has any questions, anything that they wanted to discuss. I'm very happy to take questions. You can feel free to unmute yourself, and anything that you would like to discuss, I am very open to.
Well, I just want to say thank you, Kendra, because I learned a lot tonight, and you packed so much in here, and some of the I knew. There's been new, research today, so I think it's a much better message. So I really appreciate that.
Thank you. Thank you for your kind words. Thank you for inviting me tonight.
I have to say, too, Spanish has been a passion of mine as well. I also learned in high school and college, and I'm not sure why I never became a Spanish teacher, because I like the littles. But I want to say thank you for kind of refreshing my brain and like trying to help me incorporate it more day to day in preschool as well.
Oh, thank you for sharing that. And thank you for your nice words. I feel like early childhood is such a forgiving environment if you're not a native speaker. I mean, I know that I make mistakes all the time with my verbs, or I can't think of a specific word. And young children, they'll just supply the word in Spanish for you. Oh, miss, you're thinking about this word. I mean, it's just a beautiful relationship when you're the learner and the teacher at the same time, right? You're learning from somebody that's 3 years old. It's beautiful.
Yeah, I have to say, we do have a few volumes of Spanish text, and when you do read it to them, they're very enthralled.
Yes.
Oh, what are you saying? And
yes. Oh, I love it. Wonderful.
I just want to say I love how you framed it as a celebration of students. I think that is just great, and I really hope we can get that message across to everyone. I think that's such an awesome way to put that. I was wondering, too, if you could explain, because I know we've had discussions about when we're looking at kids that are struggling, and this was so eye-opening to me, how you explain, you really want to look at them compared to peers that would have...
Right.
Yeah. Can you explain all that again? Because I think that's just so valuable for us to think about it that way.
Sure, absolutely. So, and just to give you some context, what Judy and I are talking about is new as well. So around 2011, 2012, the state produced some guidelines that help us as practitioners, as educators, when we feel like an English learner is struggling. So in other words, we're in our classroom and we have this young woman, this kindergartner, this pre-K child, second grader who's really struggling. What do we do? Because we know that we want to avoid over-identification for special education services. So what we want to do is we want to not compare a bilingual child, an English learner, to a monolingual child. And that's because a bilingual child is doing two things at once. So they have double the cognitive load. So for example, if you're learning in pre-K 4 that an author is a person that writes the book, and an author has a message, and the author's way of sharing the message is through this book, you're learning that content. You're learning that Common Core standard, and you're learning English at the same time. So it's very normal for it to take you a little bit longer because you're doing two things at once. The monolingual peer is just learning content. So when I say true peer, what we have to do is compare the child that you're concerned about to what's called a true peer. This is a child that is of the same cultural background. This is a child that is of the same linguistic background. And you want to try and find a child that has been, or more children that have been in the United States for the same amount of time, the same amount of years, and the same educational experience. This is not always easy, right? We have children that maybe there isn't another child in the school that has their same exact language, their same exact background, their same amount of years in the United States. But we really owe it to all of our children to try to make a comparison to a true peer. When we do this, then we can help avoid this problem of over-identification of bilingual and multilingual children in special education. Certainly, if you compare two true peers and you see, oh my gosh, this child really isn't making progress, of course, that they should be referred for an evaluation. But this concept of true peer is a really important one to sort of take in and process a little bit if we feel concerned about any of our students.
So Kendra, you talked a little bit about accents, and so if say you have a 4-year-old, that 4-year-olds can be difficult to understand anyway, just development. Right. And now you have a heavy accent, and peers are really struggling to understand. You're struggling to understand the child in English. Can you give us some tips on kind of how to approach that? And for folks who aren't part of the district, like what kind of team? You said team's important to help piece that out. What kind of resources could they look for or reach out to try to help make that distinction?
Great question. So, and this situation has become even more challenging, of course, with masks. Masks have added a whole new layer, and your brain is thinking like, oh my gosh, I know that this young person is trying to communicate with me. I know that this 3-year-old, 4-year-old is trying to communicate with me. The first thing I would say, and this is not to sound flippant, but the first thing I would say is try and ask yourself and ask your students, how hard are you really listening? And I know that that sounds glib, but what I mean is, are you giving that person your full attention? I mean, I'm as guilty of it as anybody else, even with my own children. I'm doing one thing, I'm cooking dinner, I'm sort of listening about their day. So when this child that maybe has a heavy accent, now you have the mask, when they're trying to communicate with you, are you stopping what you're doing and giving them your full attention? That's number one. And I always have to ask myself that same thing too, because I have a tendency to multitask. Number two is, what can we do in terms of non-linguistic support? And what I mean by that are picture boards, daily routine charts. I also really recommend if you have someone that's a new arrival, so maybe someone that has been in the United States less than a year, or just somebody with a heavy accent, I think emotion boards, where the child can point to, I'm angry, I'm hungry, my hands feel dry or sticky, I need to wash my hands. Something that helps that two-way communication go back and forth, I think, is invaluable. And I laminate all of those things. Then the child can touch it, spray it with your sanitizer, and you're ready to go. It is really challenging, especially with masks, and I have to ask children to repeat themselves, and this is my field, so I hear what you're saying. In terms of a team, so if you are concerned that a child is not making progress, you feel like they're getting this rich instruction and they're struggling in the classroom, they're struggling to keep up with their peers, the team I would suggest would certainly be the parent, number one, the family, the guardian. They are the experts. So they can say to you, yeah, you know, when I speak with him in our home language, he really doesn't understand what I'm saying. Or in our home language, he doesn't have any plurals. So he says 1 apple, 3 apple, 1 dog, 4 dog. The parent or the guardian will have this rich background that we might not have at school. So definitely the parent or the guardian is part of the team, just as like information gathering. You can also consult with your speech and language pathologist. Don't be afraid to consult with your speech and language pathologist. It's just not a referral yet. It's a collegial conversation like, hey, have you ever seen this in the past? What do you think about this? And, you know, maybe an informal observation is a really great way to go. It's a way to communicate. It's a way for the SLP, speech and language pathologist, to maybe hear the child firsthand, but it doesn't have to be the formal referral evaluation process. And then for sure the classroom teacher. So what have you noticed within the classroom? And any other person that works closely with the child, just to get different points of view. Maybe in a specials class like art or music, the child explodes with language and has all this rich vocabulary and is talking about magenta. And, you know, I don't know if anybody plays Among Us, but I had a little boy yesterday say the color cyan, which is from the game Among Us, you know, which is like this blue color. So I'd say anybody that interacts directly with the child and has some exposure and some experience, I think what we don't want to do, and we don't, is make these rush decisions in isolation. So try to get as much input as you can from people that have different kinds of expertise before we move to the process of a formal referral for special education services. Does that help answer the question a little bit?
It does. It's prompted me to think. So I'm thinking like articulation wise, if you're struggling to tell whether it's an articulation issue in English,
right,
family understands them in the home language well, that would be a more of a likely indicator that it's probably not an articulation issue?
Right.
Or do you think it's more of an accent issue?
Right. And this is very common. You know, in a perfect world, you would have someone that is bilingual. So I'm a Spanish speaker. You'd have someone that is bilingual, you know, work with the child or conduct an informal interview and just get some input about their L1, which is their home language, their first language. In some languages, which are hard to find, you know, teachers for, so we have Urdu speakers, we have Wolof speakers. If you don't have a teacher that has those language skills, the parents are really your best resource. You know, have you ever noticed that some of these sounds are really tricky in your home language? Or do you ever have a hard time understanding so-and-so when you can't see their mouth, or when he's not pointing to what he wants? Do you have a hard time understanding him? But certainly, ideally, information gathering would take place in their home language as well. Articulation is really, really tricky with bilingual English learners. And I always tell the story, Judy's probably heard this 4 times now, about my children who are monolinguals, who are English speakers. Their names are Riley and Ella. And those liquid sounds, the R's and the L's, are so hard for so many children. And I'll never forget, I really thought that my daughter Riley was going to be 20 years old and still saying why we, because people would come up to her and say, hi, what's your name? And she would say, why we. And they would look at the little sister and say, "What's your little sister's name?" Ella. And then their last name is Briggs. So they struggled to even say their own last name, Briggs. And I just remember thinking like, oh my gosh, when is she going to be able to say her own name? Well, of course, you know, she's 15 now. She's almost 16. Of course, now she can say Riley Briggs, Ella Briggs. And it took a lot of patience on my part in trying not to worry. The other side of the coin is, like I mentioned, certainly in our, you know, the L population is very diverse. And certainly in the L population, there are absolutely going to be children that are eligible for services, whether it be special education services, speech and language services. And we don't want to hesitate to provide them with those services. It's just, it's good to proceed with caution and get as much information as we can. Great questions. Anybody else have questions? Topics that they wanted to discuss? Great. I think at this point, we'll close out the session. In a moment, I'll stop recording. Please feel very free if you have questions that you'd like to ask more in a one-on-one setting or not on a recording, of course, please feel very free to email me. You can get in touch with me at any time. I'm happy to help with anything that you need. I'm happy to help with information and resources. And I truly do appreciate your time. I know that you're busy, and I sincerely appreciate you making the time for this. It means a lot, and it means a lot to our families and to our children. It's an exciting time to be in Colchester. So just since December 11th, so from December 11th until today, which is the 27th, we've had 4 new English learners move into the district. So it's really exciting for us. So thank you.
Thank you, Kendra. Thanks for your time. I really appreciate it.
Oh, it's my pleasure,
Yes.
Julie. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
My pleasure. Have
Thanks,
a great
Kendra.
day. All right, take care. I'll go ahead and stop the recording.